2020 is the worst year ever. Let's consider that statement for a second because it's something that you may hear periodically this year, particularly as the year comes to a close. 2020 is the worst year or the worst year ever. Now, I think there's a simple way to explain that, and that is that people tend to have a way of looking at short term events, or rather the scope of their own lifetime, rather than the long scope of history. It's a bit like when we read about a particularly nasty crime online or in a newspaper, people say, oh, what's society coming to? It's all falling apart. But you could find a particularly nasty crime in the newspaper 40 years ago. So that's, I think, an important starting point that people don't look at the long scope of history often, but rather the short scope of history. Now, because I've long been interested in history, and I think I have a pretty good knowledge of history, I tend to look at the longer scope because I think context matters. But anyway, let's look at 2020, and I might do a review of the year at the end of the year, but let's just look at some of the basis for this because no doubt it's been a turbulent year. It has been a rough year. So it's a year totally defined by coronavirus, and this is the deadliest pandemic in half a century. It is the deadliest pandemic since the Hong Kong flu of 1968, and it's had an unprecedented level of destruction to the world. Certainly nothing like it in my lifetime. You could take other major events, 9/11, the War on Terror, the Arab Spring, even the 2000 and late 2000s recession. All those were big world impacting events, but they didn't have the same level of truly international impact that coronavirus has had. So in that sense, it definitely stands out. The current world death toll stands at about 1.3 million and rising. And that isn't even the true death toll. It's going to be a lot higher because a lot of countries likely haven't reported the true death tolls. So let's say it's 2 or 3 million. Okay, well, that is, like I say, the deadliest since the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which killed about 1 million people. And it's now surpassed that. So actually, the deadliest since the 1918 pandemic. Um, I know AIDS has killed more people, but that's over a protected period of time. Now, that's the first and most obvious thing. But there are other problems in 2020 resulting from coronavirus. We have now, so I've actually just got a pop up saying, will you take a COVID-19 vaccine? But I'll answer that later. So, resulting from the virus, we now have a global recession not seen in decades. It's worse than the late 2000s recession. That's going to potentially have a serious impact on a lot of countries. And we know that when there are economic recessions, there then come about political problems more often than not, and a rise of political extremes. 2020 has been a year of geopolitical turbulence, particularly bad tensions between China and the West, Russia and the West. Um, the Middle East is a bit more of a mixed picture. There's serious tensions between Iran and the United States. On the other hand, there's been diplomatic successes, and one has to give the Trump administration some credit for that. Um, but there's also been an emergence of new wars, or rather a resurfacing of old wars, such as the Nagorno-Karabakh war in the Caucasus, and that is a bit more than a border skirmish. That's turned into a full-scale war. Then there is a Tigray conflict in northern Ethiopia, which is getting worse by the day. There are refugee crises all over the world. The Mediterranean still continues to be very dangerous and volatile area for crossings. The English Channel has now become a focal point. Um, the Rohingya crisis in Southeast Asia um, and Latin America continues to experience refugee crises. Um, then we have the ongoing massive problem of the Uyghur concentration camps. Nothing on that scale seen arguably since World War II in terms of the scale. Um, and when you look at all these things together, it's easy to conclude 2020 as being a turbulent year. Then we look at natural disasters. The year commenced with those devastating wildfires in Australia. Um, there has been a lot of storms all over the world, and they are getting faster and stronger. Not necessarily deadlier. Not necessarily deadlier. In fact, 2020 marks exactly 50 years this month. 50 years ago, the Bhola Cyclone in Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, caused massive devastation, 500,000 dead. Now, none of the storms this year have come anything close to that. I'm not sure if any of them have surpassed 1,000 fatalities. That caused about 500,000 fatalities. So again, context matters. Nevertheless, storms are getting more frequent, and I mean, my brother and his family lived for a while in the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, and it was just one storm after another this year. It's been a lot more. It's been a much more turbulent year than usual, so that might be an indicator of where we're going. Um, there has been some paradoxically positive impact from coronavirus. For example, ecologically, it's probably been a good thing, at least temporarily, with fewer planes in the sky, vessels on the sea, clearer skies over major Chinese and Indian cities. Um, so there's probably been some positive consequences as well. Maybe people are getting back more to social skills that they didn't have before. Who knows? Now, that's 2020. Let's now look at other years just to provide a sort of historic context. Because is it really the worst year? I don't think it is. I think it's turbulent, but I don't think it's the worst year. 1918. 1918 was the deadliest year of World War One by battlefield casualties. If you take all the years before, 1914, 15, 16, 17, and you add all those battles together, 1918 still had more battlefield casualties, in part because of the American influx and they suffered proportionally very high casualties, but also because it was the last major offensives of the war. And so it was really a winner take all situation, hence desperate fighting like the 100 Days offensive and the Spring offensive. Um, they were massively costly engagements. Um, so the deadliest year of World War One, the outbreak, of course, of the Spanish flu. And although that went into 1920, 1918 was the deadliest year. Absolutely catastrophic. It targeted healthy young people, which I think made it particularly frightening because it wasn't older people or children who you might expect to be more vulnerable, but healthy young people. And truly, every country on earth was impacted, even more than the war itself. I mean, it hit everywhere from the south of Argentina to New Zealand to Iceland and everywhere in between. Um, so I would say 1918 would certainly be a candidate, and the Spanish flu was one of the deadliest pandemics, certainly of modern times. At least 50 million dead. And then on top of that, there was an emerging nationalist movement in Ireland and Turkey, in the Baltic states. So there was turmoil coming about from those situations. I mean, World War One ended on the Western Front, but there were still conflicts going on in the East. Okay, so I think 1918 has to be in that conversation. Then we have, I would say, 1942, 43. This isn't actually listed on the Wikipedia article on this subject, but I think it should be. Think about it, 1942, 43, the absolute depth of World War Two, which was the deadliest conflict in human history. Um, the Holocaust at its peak, the horrors of the gas chambers and those death camps. The Stalinist gulags were in full operation in the war years. The atrocities in the Far East from Imperial Japan. Um, and in Stalingrad, the largest battle ever fought, the deadliest battle ever fought. Also, the siege of Leningrad was ongoing, which was the deadliest siege ever fought. So those years, 42, 43, must have been absolutely desperate. And bear in mind, neither the Allies or the Axis had any idea what what way the war would conclude. So there was widespread uncertainty, widespread death. It was a truly challenging time for humanity. On top of that, then you had famines in India and Vietnam. I would say 42, 43 would have to rank among the worst periods of human history. Then we come much further back to near antiquity, just after antiquity. The year 536 is often being mentioned this year as the worst year in history when an academic discussion has been brought about. The reason being, there was volcanic activity in that year, which seemed to cause worldwide weather-related problems. Something similar can be seen in 1782, but in 536 it was truly worldwide, and it caused severe famine and drought in both Europe and Asia. Um, and it caused unexplained fogs, another weather phenomenon. And on top of that was the plague of Justinian, which until the Black Death was the deadliest pandemic. It may have killed 25 million people. Bear in mind, the world population was a lot smaller then, so the impact would have been even greater. A truly devastating event. So 536 is definitely up there. Um, Now, on a more local level, looking just at Britain, I would say the year 1069-70, that winter would be one of our worst. We often say 1940 was our most desperate hour, but 1069-1070 would have to surely be in that rating. That was the year that forces of William the Conqueror launched the so-called Harrying of the North, which some have called a genocide. It was a scorched earth campaign to subdue the north of England. It might even explain north-south animosity to this day, but some scholars have estimated as many as 100,000 people died. This had a massive impact on the north of England. So, given the population at that time on a local level, thinking just of the British Isles, I would say that has to be among our worst times. And for Ireland, of course, 1847, the year of the Great Famine and Gorta Mór. But there's any number of years from the Middle Ages, I would say, would be in this conversation. 1348, the peak of the Black Death. 1258, the Siege of Baghdad, which was one of the bloodiest sieges in history. You could pick any number of years before the time of modern medicine, sanitation, and advanced science that could maybe rank among the worst years. So when we look at all of that, even recent history, 1970 Bhola Cyclone that I mentioned, deadlier than anything this year in terms of natural disasters. So looking at historic context is important. 2020 has been a turbulent time, and I think the American election hasn't helped because it's created question marks over the world superpower. Not helped by Donald Trump's failure to concede, in my opinion. But at the same time, we need to consider um, what we have now and what we didn't have in the past. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I can still talk on modern technology. I still have access to soap and sanitation. So there are counters to these things. Okay, let me know your thoughts, but I think it's an interesting discussion. If I was to put my bet on the worst period of human history, I would say 42, 43 would be pretty close to the top. Okay, let me know your thoughts.